I recently posted a video about why people are leaving Canada at a record number. As of the time I'm recording this video, that video has gained 163,000 views. Whoa, that's a lot of views. And in that video, I also mentioned that I moved from Singapore to Canada. Many people seem to be wondering, why did I make the move? Or should I say, questioning my decisions? In this video, I am going to answer that question of why I decided to move from Singapore to Canada. Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. My name is Fabi, and on this channel I share stories about my non-linear life journey to encourage you to embrace your own journey and feel less alone in the process. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, in this video I want to share with you the reasons why I decided to move from Singapore to Canada. I am going to structure this video into 3 parts. We'll start with a Singapore 101 since my analytics show that people from all over the world watch my video, so I thought it would be great to give some context on what Singapore is like from my perspective, of course, and then we'll move on to my 4 reasons of why I decided to move from Singapore to Canada, and then we'll wrap up with conclusion. Without further ado, let's get started. From my POV, Singapore is a small but mighty country. It is actually one of the smallest countries in the world, but it is definitely an economic powerhouse in Asia. If we want to put things into perspective, Singapore is just 16% larger than Toronto, but only Toronto, excluding the GTA, and 10% smaller than Calgary. The things I really like about the country is I really appreciate how it is safe, clean, stable with a strong economy, and it is efficient. It is efficient to the nth degree. Let me put it that way. The public transportation has a really great infrastructure. It is very reliable and affordable. This is the map of Singapore MRT. As you can see here, it is pretty extensive and it covers the entire island from coast to coast. And I know that I've alluded to the efficiency earlier, but truly, Singapore is super efficient. I can't even emphasize how efficient things are, from processes, people, systems, you name it. It's very efficient, and you could really tell when you deal with like the bureaucracy there or even the day-to-day stuff. And that's just how the society works in general, I feel like. Now, let's move on to my reasons of why I decided to leave Singapore for Canada. The first one is high population density, aka overpopulated. Remember when I said at the beginning that Singapore is a small country and the size of the country is only 10% larger than Toronto? City of Toronto, okay, not including the GTA, and 16% smaller than Calgary. In that size of land, there's over 5 million people living in the country. So you definitely would have a different definition of personal space if you live there as compared to living in Canada. So personal space is something that I found missing and substantiated by the chop chop culture. Chop chop literally means just chop, just cut to the chase, get things done and move on. At times I would feel overwhelmed. When I was considering where to move, I took this into account as well because I had always lived in very busy metropolitan cities, not only Singapore. So I thought to myself, why not make a change and move to a quieter place? Now, I live in Vancouver and the neighborhood that I live in is very quiet and peaceful, which I love. And obviously there's also options to live in a more vibrant, more happening neighborhood. It's not to say that I don't like crowd. If I want to hang and go to a more happening area, I would go to Commercial Drive or Main Street or Robson. But then I have options. I have a choice to retreat whenever I want to. So I really like having that option. And I feel like I have more space in general as compared to when I was living in Singapore. I feel like even downtown Vancouver is not comparable to the hustle and bustle of Singapore. I will say if you've been to Singapore and you go to Central Orchard or Tanjong Pagar or Clarke Quay, maybe it's more comparable for the Toronto folks. It's more comparable to the crowd on Yonge and Dundas Street in general. I feel like it's a bit tricky to compare Singapore to Canada because Canada is so big and every area is so different, but I hope that my analogy would give you some ideas of how crowded Singapore is in general. Number 2 is fast-paced living and hustle culture. With the output and the effort that the country, including its residents, had to pull through to bring Singapore to where it is today, obviously there's a lot to pull through. So it's inevitable that it would create a hustle culture. And I would say that hustle culture, I think in general, is more normalized in more developed cities or countries in Asia, not only Singapore. So this would translate into a couple different things, such as the expectation of your availability flexibility after hours, the work hours in general, the social landscape. This culture sort of blurs the boundaries between work and life, which is not really for me. And the kiasu culture, or the fear of losing, also adds a layer of competitiveness in my opinion, because people are worried and anxious of falling behind, so people will do more, be more, achieve more. And yeah, here in Canada, I think you have options. Like, your work culture will heavily depend on where you live and work in Canada. If I were to compare, I think the Singapore work culture would be the closest to Toronto, even though I will say Singapore is a lot more fast-paced. For example, for me, I live in Vancouver, but I work with a national team, and my team is coast to coast from Montreal to Vancouver. Most of my team members are actually based out of Toronto, so I sort of adopt the Toronto work life, if that makes sense. But I still appreciate how in this season of life I'm able to prioritize what's important to me, and I'm able to take that hybrid approach in terms of my work and life, which I really appreciate. And I don't think I can attribute this piece to just the fact that I moved from Singapore to Canada alone that made my work-life balance improved dramatically. Maybe from the experience that I've gained over the years as well. I now know better what works and what doesn't work for me. But I will say that moving to Canada and being in the Canadian work environment and the pace definitely plays a part. Number 3 is the natural landscape of Canada. You can start connecting the dots why I opted to move to the West Coast in general versus the East Coast. When I first moved to Canada, I moved to Edmonton in Alberta, and then I moved out to Vancouver. And one of the reasons why Canada was appealing to me as well, because I really like being in the outdoors. I remember when I was still flying as a flight attendant, whenever I had annual leave, I would use that to go on road trips. I would go to New Zealand, to Tasmania in Australia, or when I had a long layover in the US, for example, I would use that to go to national parks. That's also something that I really appreciated, is like the nature of Canada. I appreciate snowy mountains and beaches a lot, even though there's a lot more amazing beaches in Southeast Asia, but the snowy mountains is incomparable, you know? The rainy season, especially in Vancouver, and the depressing winter still suck, but there's a good trade-off with what you can get in the summer. Summer is great here. If you could learn how to make the best use of your time during the winter, for example, taking up winter sports and things like that, it's not as bad, I feel like. The 4th reason, which is the last one, is to gain new perspective and life experience. Let me share some context on this point. I think that this has something to do with the difference in Asian culture and Western culture in general. So Singapore is actually one of the most westernized Asian countries in the world, but even so, I feel like the Asian culture is still pretty strong, which kind of makes sense, right? It's more like, okay, learn to fit and create harmonious relationship, don't stand out, which is totally fair. There's nothing wrong with that. I just feel like in the Western culture, it's more like embrace your individuality, embrace your uniqueness, be proud of who you are, be whoever you want to be. Even though I know that both sides, if taken to the extreme, can be really concerning. For example, like in Canada, there's this concern going on around the country being too woke or too liberal, which I think could also create an issue. So I feel like anything that's too extreme is not good. So for me, myself, I try to create a balance and strike a balance between the two. I do appreciate Canada for its liberalism, but I also understand that there is some challenges that comes with it as well. And same with Asia, with a culture that appreciate people who fit in, who don't stand out, who just put their head down and do their job. That also creates a different set of challenges. This is just a general sentiment. I know it can be so nuanced. If we were to break it out, the nuances one by one, this would be like a 3-hour long video. So I'm not gonna do that. And I do think that there's also a lot of other aspects that we need to take into account. It would depend on your upbringing, your values, your life experiences. Everything plays into part and shapes people into who they are. So it's really hard to pin down. Overall, I feel like I appreciate the culture in Canada where you are encouraged just to be yourself, to embrace your uniqueness, to accept yourself for who you are, and don't worry too much about fitting in general. Even if it's not, and even if it's just my perspective, that's just how I like to live my life, and I feel like I have control and freedom over what to keep and what to let go of. When it comes to the life experience part, I am a big believer that life is meant to be lived and experienced. I don't mind making trial and error in my life. Like, I try to take calculated risks and make informed decisions, but honestly, who knows what will happen, right? This is what my channel is all about, is to embrace the journey. So I'm okay with that. Now, the question is Canada meant to serve me for this season of life only or for multiple seasons? I don't know. We will see. Now, you might think that I am financially privileged to be able to do this, and I'm gonna tell you right now, the answer is no. I've actually talked about how I built my life from scratch through flying as a flight attendant, and this is the video that you can check out if you're interested. Last but not least, I also saw some negative/aggressive comments in the video that I posted about why people are leaving Canada, minus the unnecessary aggression. Honestly, you know what? I want to thank you for reminding me that I have options, because I'm grateful for having options. Not everyone has the option to move back or to somewhere else, because honestly, that's something that not everyone has. Not everyone has the freedom of choice to move back or to move somewhere else. So that is something that I do not take for granted. Freedom of choice is something that I really appreciate. I like having options in my life. So I am grateful for having options, and I like to thank you for reminding me. I know that everyone's situation is different, and I can't speak for 7 billion people in the world. It's literally impossible. And I also don't want to get into comparative suffering because there's endless scenarios to compare. So there's no point in doing that. If you're still watching up to this point, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you find this video useful. And moving forward, I'll also talk about the reasons why I decided to move from Alberta to BC. And also maybe the pros and cons of living in Singapore and more about my experience living abroad. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel because I would really appreciate that. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.